Thank you for being with us. We also have Angela Maria, and we have also one other person coming in, but we're going to get started. Just respect everyone's time. Good afternoon, good evening to everyone out there sharing the space of dialogue called Bombardments in the High Seas and Terror as Policy. It's a pleasure to be able to share the space with our wonderful guest today. This is Diana Mosqueda from Global Exchange. The issue that we're engaging today is something that we've been watching on TV and in the press in the last weeks. As you know, the U.S. military forces, under the orders of the Trump administration, have repeatedly attacked small ships in the Caribbean coast and in the Pacific coast of Colombia, with the stated aim of combating narcoterrorism, leaving hundreds dead or dozens dead. Thus far, the administration hasn't presented any evidence that would justify these breaches of international law. Currently, they are placing troops and bringing vessels to the Caribbean. These bellicose actions and these military operations have generated great alarm in the region, raising concerns about escalating interventions and also regime change in Venezuela. Also, Gustavo Petro in Colombia has decried these attacks publicly, characterized them as murder, and critiqued openly the Trump administration. And so we're here today to provide a Latin American perspective about of what is happening, looking at this from a humanitarian, legal, and societal perspective, and to talk about how we can resist these developments from civil society. So we have some great guests with us today who will share their opinions regarding the situation, provide their analysis, and we believe that these will be very enriching for us. We have Francesca Emanuel, the analyst of U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean. She's an expert in U.S. international policy. We also have with us Ali Bantu Ashanti. He's a lawyer and activist, Afro-Colombian lawyer and activist, founder of Just Justicia Racial, with over 20 years of work alongside Afro-descendant communities and grassroots communities, including boatmen and fisher communities. Welcome for being with us today. Thank you. We'd like to start with you, Francesca, to understand the context of around what is happening in the Pacific and in the Caribbean. We'd like to start with the following question. What do you think are the domestic and geopolitical interests of the United States to attack for attacking these vessels? Thank you very much, Diana, and thank you, Ali, for being here with us to share your experience and your human rights expertise, and also to everyone that is participating here today in this very important seminar. I think you already mentioned that nobody in Latin America or in the Caribbean believes that 20% of the ships that are actually, or 20% of the vessels in the military that are now being sent to the Caribbean since the 2nd of September, and that the 72 people, at least 72 people that have been killed extrajudiciously, that this is all happening as a result of what this administration claims that it has to do with combating drug trafficking. Also, we don't believe that the people in the region believe that these military actions have the objective of attacking narco-terrorism, which is a term that has really been developed by this administration to generate uh, ghosts and villains, to invent enemies and foes in countries in any country that they like, and to thereby carry out horrible actions, devastating actions. As far as these extrajudicial killings and military deployments, thinking about this objective, this attempt to confuse us, to make us think that this is a fight against narco-terrorism or narco-trafficking. The objective, as Diana was saying, it has to do with geopolitical interest. On one hand, to topple the Maduro regime, but it would go further. The U.S. State Department, which is right now led by Marco Rubio, who throughout his whole political career has always wanted to topple the Cuban government as well. There's this theory that if you topple Maduro in Venezuela, then you can set off a chain reaction and topple other countries or other administrations that are not attuned or consent to the US policy. In the United States, we have to think about the perspective here. I think that in Latin America and in the Caribbean, the people's perspectives are clear, their opinions are clear. But in the United States, what they want to do is flood the public sphere with junk to create disinformation, to create chaos in order to distract us from the real objective. I also want to clarify something else that is very important. If it is the case that there is a geopolitical interest here to reinforce US hegemony in the region and also an attempt to reestablish control and domination in the region, well, this is not a clear strategy that we see here, and there's multiple elements to it. And we saw that in the past weeks when we saw the coverage in the United States. There are different ways that this is being presented. And what do I mean here? It means that, well, it also means that we have an opportunity to respond and act to that situation from from Latin America and the Caribbean. That requires us to be organized, facing in relation to these attacks, which we have never seen are unprecedented in the Caribbean and by the United States. Thank you very much, Francesca. I want to remind everyone before we continue that we have interpretation. If you need to access interpretation, there's a button on the bottom part of your screen. There is a button with a globe icon. So keeping in mind what Francesca has just said, there is a large possibility that this will increase, that this will scale up. And so what would a regional intervention look like, and what possibilities are there for regional cooperation and collaboration for this? Well, when we look at these almost daily attacks now, we now see that it is indeed scaling up. It's very alarming. And I think we are all here in agreement, you and Ali, and perhaps a lot of our audience. Unfortunately, the coercive measures of the Trump administration, there's these threat of tariffs. And that means that our political leaders in our region might subject themselves to the whims of this administration, and there's a huge risk that a lot of politicians in the region will now be denouncing this situation. We've already mentioned that Gustavo Petro has actively been denouncing these extrajudicial actions and calling out the U.S. interests to topple the Venezuelan government. This could lead to various scenarios like bombing directly into the Venezuelan territory or deployment of drones to Venezuela, which could to attack Maduro directly, which could then unleash a civil war. I was speaking with activists in the region, and they were telling me that if something like that would happen in Venezuela, it could even lead to the separation of the Venezuelan territory, with some figures financed by the United States proposing this type of solution or this partitioning to divide the Chavez Chavista regions from those that are not Chavista regions. And really, this would be a response to how the United States has been really suffocating this country with sanctions in the past years. There's been a lot of suffering as a result of that, a lot of pain and impacts throughout the region. And so, if there is a type of conflict, an internal conflict, it could set off other situations, other conflicts. There's also possibilities for interstate conflicts by military forces. This is as the declaration from as the Salat declaration from a few days ago said that this is a peaceful region, that this is a region that stands for peace. They're against militarization. They're against these int this geopolitical intrigue, but ultimately coming out of this recent meeting between the European Union and the United States, it's a very lukewarm message at the end of the day. We've also seen that presidents of the region like Lula and Sheinbaum, while they have said important things, it hasn't been at the level of what we would have hoped. And in multilateral spaces like the Organization of American States or the Inter-American Court, where you would expect declarations or condemnations of these extrajudicial activities or this menacing against the Venezuelan government and other and the acts of those that are violating norms and conventions in the region. Well, we would expect there to be condemnations about for all that too, but we see that that is not happening in the situation. There is a void. There is international infrastructure that is established to respond to this, and we're not seeing any action coming out of those spaces responding to all of these potential harms that could come to the region. Thank you very much, Francesco. Thank you for helping us understand this very complex situation in our region. Ali, we'd like to ask you now, what is your reading? And keeping in mind that what's happening in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, keeping aside of the fact that those are illegal, what, how can they be responded to from the space of the courts and legal terrains? Thank you very much for everyone that is here today. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for Global Exchange, Francesca, and all of the organizations that have made this possible today. From Justicia Racial Collective, we've been carrying out work in Colombia connected to people that are incarcerated due to drug in relation to drugs, and particularly in areas that have to do where the Trump administration is attacking. Unfortunately, this is nothing new. What's happening in the Caribbean and on the Pacific coast in the past month, where we've seen Donald Trump carrying out murders, extrajudicial killings, this is not new. In Colombia, there's a long trajectory of this. There's a lot to be said from Latin America about these types of situations, about people being killed because of the war on drugs. And as far as the way that people are impacted by this, if if we could say that we could say that the war on drugs has been a condemnation, has been a horrible impacts for Black populations and for Latin America in general. Those that are impacted by drug policies that are determined by the United States and the European Union or the United Nations. It, it should be said that it was never the objective to do away with drugs, but rather to be able to intervene, to be able to have military deployments in these territories. And now we are seeing that happening much more openly, particularly on the part of the United States. From the perspective of law and human rights, in my experience, there's a sense of impotence right now. When we saw the first bombing, I had an opportunity to speak with various colleagues, and we thought that we could carry out some strategic litigations, something that would at least initiate a conversation about how this could be end, how U.S. empire could be resisted. And what came out of our analysis was basically the conclusion that there's not much we can do, that we're at the mercy, essentially, of Donald Trump. If Donald Trump wants to end these attacks and murders, he'll do it. It'll be something that he can decide to do. But as far as legal frameworks that would allow us to effectively confront the extrajudicial executions, it's almost impossible. And so there's a necessary debate to have about to what extent are these multilateral organisms working, to what extent is the European or the Organization of American States, how powerful is it, what capacity does it have to stop these massacres that the US Navy is carrying out in the Caribbean and in the Pacific coasts. I think that the Organization of American States doesn't have that power in the same way that they haven't had the power to stop the war in Palestine and all of the homicides there. I think right now the international community and level of the realm of international law has to rethink itself, has to reinvent itself in a way in order to be able to address and prevent these types of crimes so that they are not met with impunity. In coming out of the select gathering, it's important to keep in mind that the people and the governments of different countries come together to raise their voices because I think that the response to this is not going to come from the legal terrains. Rather, it's going to come out of the terrain of civil society organizing. That's what is going to allow for de-escalation, and that is going to be the terrain that allows for something new to develop, something new for our region. The internal conflicts and wars in our region, it could expand to new levels. That is a possibility right now. I agree with Francesca that this is a huge lie that the this Trump's idea that this is an attack against organized crime and drug traffickers, particularly when you look at who they're attacking, and when you these boat the people on the boats, we see that these are not drug traffickers. And as far as drug trafficking that happens through these channels on these boats, that's the weakest link. That's one of the most marginal parts of the international drug trade and international drug market. And so we're questioning, we're also well, we're also questioning what about the drug traffickers in the United States, because Peru, Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia are people that are being jailed in the United States, just like black people are being jailed. But what about the heads of these drug cartels, people that are providing these drugs to millions and millions of consumers in the United States? We understand that there are local small scale drug sellers, but there are large distributors, and this includes drug trafficking that is connected to Wall Street and to banks. So there's a huge hypocrisy here. And right now, I think we have a lot of risks on the horizon. Thank you, Ali. Something that you were mentioning that we have seen uh, is this internalization of violence to such an extent that when we see this type of news, we just flip the page or flip the channel and lose sight of the fact that these are real human lives that are lost, the lives that are of the people that were on these boats. And so, what can we say about these people? Who were these individuals? And we know, Ali, that you are engaged in work that connects with these people, that engages these communities. And if you could talk about the drug trade and the relationship with these communities, who are just oftentimes assumed to be guilty or implicit a- involved actors. Yes, I think a large portion of society, people have decided that these are communities whose rights to life can be denied. And we see this happening in countries like Colombia, where this war culture, this culture of war and of violence, has led us to believe that some people can be killed, that they're expendable and with impunity. And that's why we haven't seen any protests in Colombia standing up for these people that have been killed, nor to stand up for the lives of the people that have been killed in the Pacific or the Caribbean. No one is taken to the streets over this, and it reflects a certain level of acceptance. It reflects that in one way or another, we're we believe that these people are expendable, just as people are being killed. And it's because people have experienced this in Colombia. This is not something new. We have had to bury hundreds of thousands of victims of violence, particularly deaths resulting from the so-called war on drugs. Also, this war is one of the most terrible way, it's a terrible form of new neocolonialism that which we've seen in the last 50 years. It's a shameless dimension of this. Entire governments and entire countries are being subjected to the external interest, including entire legal systems and court systems. And that's what we're seeing right now in Venezuela with this attempt to topple Nicolas Maduro. There's an interest to control the petroleum and the mineral reserves in that country. And also in Colombia, it's a very strategic territory for the United States, for US interests. And so the democracy that isn't amenable to the US empire, well, they're going to try to topple anything that stands, that is an obstacle to that. In these territories, the Pacific, Colombian Pacific, from where I'm from, We have four departments there, the majority of Afro-descendant communities there. These are the territories that produce cocaine, but they're also the same states that have the most poverty. And so we could ask ourselves, how is it possible that a place that produces so much cocaine could be also a very poor region? But the answer is, well, is easy. It's they're poorer because the value and the profits never return to these locations of where cocaine is produced. And so we're risking our whole communities in this, and we're also providing the raw material of human bodies of Black youths who are exposing themselves. They're putting their lives on the line in order to be involved in this terrible market where we always have to pay with blood, and ultimately, and where there's ultimately never a state policy that would prevent these violent attacks to this, to that then comes back to these very vulnerable communities. And so, as far as the organizations and civil society, if we could say the people's organizations, they are talking about how we can prevent these harms and the repetition of these harms against these particular populations. Part of the effort has been focused on the reduction of har- consumption harms, but we haven't talked about production, the transportation, the distribution. What's happening there? Why isn't there any policy that focuses on those area? Why are there no organizations that are taking up those vital questions? And that's something that we would like to bring to the table as civil society actors. And particularly when we look at what's happening at the Pacific and the Caribbean, we need to understand that we need to decriminalize uh, the distribution. We need to decriminalize distribution when it is so intimately connected to the lack of infrastructure and poverty. And so that's what we're working on right now. Thank you very much. We'll be very eager to monitor that work. Francesca, keeping in mind the impotence that we're feeling faced with the multilateral collaborations and also the impotence of international rights mechanisms, the impotence to be able to stop this. Well, for those of us that are not closely aware of what's happening in the United States and how this is being experienced in the United States, what can you tell us about the different perspectives in the US Congress regarding this? What's happening there and what possibilities are being discussed there in order to halt what's happening in the Caribbean and the scaling up of aggressions? Before I talk about the actions that have been carrying out to halt these extrajudicial operations and the intent to topple Nicolas Maduro's government, I want to go back to something that Ali mentioned and underscore something that I think is really important. If it is the case, or it being that hundreds, uh, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed in the name of the so-called war on drugs, if, well, this is still an extraordinary situation that we're experiencing now. This is unprecedented to have a military deployment in the Caribbean that's based on a false narrative, the false narrative of combating narcoterrorism. That is unprecedented. And now we have had people killed basically on video because Hegseth is bringing cameras to this. He's he's transmitting this through his X uh, account, his Twitter. It makes it possible for people to witness these homicides of people who we don't know of people that we don't know who they are. So this is extraordinary and unprecedented. And the same justification is being used, the same justification as we saw in previous decades, but in a new way. And so it's important to keep that in mind. And it's also important to keep in mind that the objective is not the war against drugs, but rather it's a geopolitical endeavor. It's about having an interest of sub subjecting those countries that do not that are not amenable to Washington to subject those to U.S. dominance. That's the ultimate geopolitical interest. What and so what the Trump administration wants is for us to be confused about that. It's for us to not be talking about this attempt at reaffirming hegemony in the region. I was listening to an analyst the other day saying anyone that feels themselves to be an emperor wants an empire. And so we have with Trump a person that wants to think of himself as an emperor, as a and this is a person that is being influenced by the radical right, and it's reflected in Marco Rubio's handling of State Department. We see uh, a series of operations and actions that would establish that type of empire. And so that's why all of the countries in the region are at risk here. And now I'll move to talking about what are the actions that are happening in the US Congress and in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. What did we see last week? There was a resolution for military powers. This was proposed by Schiff and King and also Rand Paul from the war resolutions or world war powers resolution. It's the only legal mechanism that the US Congress has at its hands to halt a military aggression like the one we're seeing. It was something that was initially developed in the 70s. It's the only way that the United States can get involved in an aggressive operation is through the approval of Congress. And so that resolution was brought up in the Congress. It was brought to vote. Unfortunately, it didn't receive enough votes. Nevertheless, it's a very important mechanism through which to apply pressure because last week I was really concerned that a war could be unleashed in the region, that bombardments would happen in Venezuelan territory, or that there would be drones that would be attacking Maduro or other government members, Venezuelan government members. I was really concerned about that. I think a lot of other Venezuelans were as well. And we saw that this resolution in the US Congress pushed the Trump administration to meet with Congress members and to receive information, and they had to plead to them to not support that for that measure because they did have the power. It showed that they did have the power to limit these war or these aggressive operations. And so out of that vote, Mark Rubio had to meet with Congress. They There was a discussion that basically said that the United States does not have congressional approval to be carrying out military aggressions in Venezuelan territory. So that resolution for war powers, which we don't know much about that in Latin America, that's what Congress has in its toolbox. And I see that as the strategy that we can support from Latin America to halt the military aggressions in our region and to halt the possibility of moving towards war. These coercive measures of this administration are silencing the politicians in our region. And so we should also perhaps focus on what are the possibilities that we have in the US Congress, what possibilities there are in the United States to halt that. And there are also two resolutions that are coming up in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And the Senate could also submit another initiative for reduction of war powers. And so that's what's being worked on in the United States by a Congress that we initially thought that wasn't so allied to the Latin America, and yet we see that they have this strategy at their hands that could help us halt this phenomena. Thank you, Francesca. At the congressional level, what kind of balance of powers do you see there? Well, we have the Democrats who in the Senate voted overwhelmingly in that last vote. They voted to halt the military offensives. We only had two Republicans that voted to halt. All other Republicans voted to allow it to happen. Donald Trump's influence over the Republican Party is really strong. There are sectors in the Republican Party that they don't really care about policy and they're only interested in the America First policy or ideology. And they are actually not that thrilled about what's happening with these military aggressions. The South Commando, we're talking about uh, Navy vessels that can carry 90 warplanes and has three that and also has missile launchers, large distance missile launchers, 13 million billion dollars. And right now, we don't know how much has been spent. We don't know how much tax dollars has gone into this military deployment in the Caribbean, all standing on this justification of combating narco trafficking. But there are parts of the Republican sector that are not happy with what's going on, and they could potentially support at the legal level measures to halt this development or these aggressions. But I agree with Ali. It's the political domain that is going to be the most important here. That's the terrain that where we have to be active and that could lead to an offensive against these aggressions. Thank you. I think it's interesting to see that you both agree that you think that it's the political terrain, the civil society political domain where this can be strengthened. I also want to let everyone know that you can ask questions in the Q&A section and we'll direct those to our panelists. This next question is directed to both of you. For civil society, what are those actions that citizens could carry out to pressure the US government to respect international law and to disarm this crisis? Or do, Ali, I've spoken too much. Please go ahead. Thanks, Francesca. I think that definitely it's the people, the ones that need to take up their own destiny. They need to embrace their own destiny and make it happen. There should be also tribunals, or symbolic, if they perhaps tribunals, so that countries can begin to carry out processes, popular processes, community processes that are casting a judgment on this and sending a message to the United States and to the world about the homicides, the massacres that Donald Trump is carrying out in this region. It's definitely the people. They have the power to stand up and to make their voice be heard in the region and to make sure that Donald Trump doesn't get his way, to knowing now that he's mobilized all of these military power just to establish a threat, just to present a threat to the region. That's something that could lead to something else that we wouldn't want. And I do have a lot of respect for some congresspersons in the United States, but nevertheless, I think this ideology of America first, well, that's always been the case. That's always been the ideology, and we've had to deal with those impacts throughout the whole continent, right? This is a Congress that received with applause Netanyahu to its halls. And so Latin America needs to stand up, mobilize, and definitively reject these types of situations and to call on what's left of the United Nations and the Organization of American States to proclaim forcefully and explicitly to speak up against this threat that is being brought to Latin America and particularly to the Caribbean. Yes, I agree with Ali's comments. I also want to mention something that I've seen in the recent days, and that's that in England or in the United Kingdom, they've stopped sharing intelligence communications with the United States because they don't want to take the risk of being complicit in these extrajudicial actions in the Caribbean. Also, I think this is a strategy. I think Colombia's doing the same thing since yesterday. And I think it's a strategy that all countries should replicate. And the people in the countries should pressure their governments to take that same measure. And also people that are in the public sphere, that they should also be pressured to take up or to support this initiative. But it's a really difficult situation right now. Our political figures, including the ones that are most vocal and willing to stand up against the United States, are stepping back right now. They don't want to be sanctioned. They're concerned about tariffs. They don't want to be responsible for that. They don't want to be responsible for bringing political instability or more poverty to their countries. Um, and we've seen that happen in the Caribbean. The Caribbean countries have made a declaration about the militarization in the Caribbean, and it was a very weak statement, tenuous. Trinity and Tobago, who has had U.S. military forces come to their actual territories, they're and public, the prime minister of one of the countries also said that this action of eliminating these boats and these killings, that they make sense, that they fit into the logic of fighting narcoterrorism. And they made that statement not because they really believe that, but rather because they're under incredible pressure and coercive measures that could be imposed by the Trump administration. And so I think it's very important, it's fundamental that wherever we go, that we as Latin Americans, if we're writing, if we're having meetings, if we're engaging other our citizens, that we need to continue to bring attention to this and to talk about the militarization of the Caribbean, that these extrajudicial operations are not responding to an interest of reducing narco trafficking. We know that I'm Peruvian, and I know that the Caribbean is not the transit route for drugs, for cocaine. It's coming from the Pacific. So it doesn't even make sense. We know that fentanyl is produced in Mexico. It's not passing through the Caribbean. We also know that in no time in history has there been drug cartels have been classified as terrorist organizations. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing, for instance, the Tren Garagua, a criminal organization, they're being character described as a cartel, and that is just somebody's invention. Or there's this talk of the Cartel of Soles, which doesn't even exist. Even members that are connected to those actors, they're saying none of this is true. The idea that Nicolas Maduro is part of these networks, that's also not true. And so we need to do our part to make sure that we, yes, I wanted to add to something that you said, and that's that the military presence of the United States in Colombia is huge. They are threatening us from one side, but then they also have their own military bases inside of our country, 6 or 7 military bases. And I think that should be, or that could be Petro's next step to very explicitly remove or be forthright in removing any U.S. military presence from Colombian land and seas, and to halt the sale of any purchase of weapons from the United States. That's more necessary now than ever, because even in our own territory, they could actually try to carry out operations against our government, Petro and some of our congresspersons, as has already been discussed by some military, or excuse me, some congressional members in the United States. So Colombia has previously, the Colombian presidents have previously collaborated with drug kingpins. We have that confirmed. We know that that's happened. And the United States has not gone after them. For instance, what's happened with Uribe, Uribe Vélez, that was confirmed. And the narco politicians, like presidents, those politicians that pay for their campaigns with drug money, that have enriched themselves through drug monies, the United States has never gone after them. But when it comes to Petro, the president that has decommissioned the most amount of drugs and halted drug trafficking, they're going after him. That's the one that they want to capture, and they're talking about capturing. So I wanted to bring that up and put that on. And yes, a lot of organizations, social civil society organizations, they need to come together to expand that message of their rejection of these operations, and to talk about all of the impacts that the war on drugs has brought, and to make it clear that this is not what needs to be happening to dismantle drug trafficking and drug violence in our region. And also in places like Ecuador, where they are having a referendum this weekend, I think, for them to reject the creation of a U.S. Or a foreign military base on their territory, for them to reject those types of developments, anything, things that bring a that create more of an infrastructure for them to be in the orbit of the United States, and to take measures to reject these types of military developments in their countries. Because after Machado won the Nobel Peace Prize, which I think is absolutely ridiculous, because in the last few weeks she's been actually requested US senators and congresspersons to bomb her own country. Well, at least in the United States, this figure has been identified. Machado, this person who is asking for her own country to be bombed, they're identifying her as the real voice of Venezuelan society. And it would be important for Venezuelans to raise their own voice and demand that these types of interventions would not be carried out, that there should not be bombardments to their territory, and that the lives of millions there should be put at risk, and to also have interventions that would contribute to the humanitarian migration crisis that is happening in Venezuela. And it would be terrible for any of that to happen, for a war to be unleashed in the Americas. Yes, I wanted to finalize by saying, Diana, if you would allow me, I just wanted to say that it's possible that Donald Trump may provoke Simon Bolivar's unrealized dream. I believe that a war against Venezuela would be a war against the region. I truly believe that. And I don't think that the resistance would be coming just from Venezuela. That's to say, when one of us is attacked, all of us feel attacked, and that could provoke a level of patriotism that resides in the heart and in the bones of Latin Americans that for so long has supported uh, U.S. imperialism and has had to deal with U.S. imperialism for so long. And so, definitely, I think an aggression against Venezuela would be an aggression against all of us. That's how all of Latin America would receive that. I am currently in Detroit in an event organized by the Drug Policy Alliance on drug policy, and tomorrow the discussions will begin about drug policy reforms. It's a very powerful or an important event. And so now with the ideas that Francesca is mentioning, I'm going to share those to take that to the space to see if we can have a proclamation or a statement for no intervention in what Donald Trump is calling the war against narcoterrorism in the region. So we're going to make a call for that tomorrow. And I wanted to thank Francesca for sharing that idea or promoting that idea. Thank you very much to both of you. I see that we're running out of time, and I do see that we have some questions in the chat, and I'll be heavy-handed here and say that we just don't have any time for them, unfortunately. This has been a space to understand what's happening geopolitically. But I am going to synthesize some questions. Do you think that the United States is ultimately interested in controlling petroleum areas in Latin America? And then do you think that this could provoke, do you think that this could make it so that left-wing governments could be established in Latin America? As far as the petroleum resources, yes, I think it's very important. That's a very important factor. In this formula and the equation, the State Department knows that Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world. So absolutely, that's one of the main reasons, if not the main reason, that Maduro's government and Chavez's government were always targeted by the US. Um, they always wanted to topple these because of that. Also, we can't, but nevertheless, we can't put aside the ideological and political matters, the political dimension. That's very important because if if Maduro has provided benefits to the United States when it comes to petroleum extraction? Well, Marco Rubio and the Cuban American sector that push the most imperialist faction in the Congress, many of them coming from Florida, well, they they understand that it's not it's not just about for them the economic dimension. For them, they want to topple a leftist government. That's what they always have had in mind. And that's why they've punished so harshly with sanctions this president in Venezuela and also in Colombia, Petro. And as far as if this could lead to a situation where right governments are brought out of power, are pushed out of power, it's hard to say. In the United States, one of the longest wars that they've ever had was in Afghanistan. No one knew that it would last 20 years. So you always know when you're starting a war, but you're not sure when it's going to end, and you're not sure of the repercussions that will it will have. And so we're going to try to make it so that no war even begins in the region. That's our ultimate aim. Yes, there's another question for Francesca. A lot, a lot of the oil from Venezuela goes to China. Do you think this is one of the reasons that there's the situation is being this farce is being developed? Yes, I think the level of hegemony, it's about regional hegemony, and it has to do with some of the market deficiencies and weakening of the United States in relation to different markets. For instance, right now, Peru is more commercially connected to China than it is to the United States. And so these economic impacts are important here. But again, I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that there's also ideological battles going on here, which I think are really important factors. Thank you very much. Ali, we have a question for you. I think Ali's proposal for legalization of drugs is really important to have a non-punitive policies for drugs, and that's something that can contribute to eliminate the ending of the of wars in the region. Could you talk about what has been done in this regard in the region and what next steps should be taken? Well, that is the roadway. Science lets us know that regulation and decriminalization is the way towards having better, safer societies. Gustavo Petro with Lopez Obrador, they had an initial gathering in Cali in 2023 where and in which another gathering of a summit was organized or promoted to look at ways to end the drug markets. And that's ultimately where humanity must move towards. That's the ultimate goal that humanity needs to attain and must attain. And the work that we've done with global exchange, we're also working with them to organize that summit and make it accessible for communities and to also make it something that is developed and produced by people and people's organizations. So we know that we'll have important governments participating in this. We know that the governments need to move forward, they need to advance in this, and Colombia needs another president with as much courage or even more courage as Petro has had to move forward with drug reform and this new vision for for vision for liberating our societies from the drug markets. Now, this has intended to harm countries like the United States, where they have so many consumers, but they have they need to take this up for themselves. But we are sovereign nations too, and we can't continue to abide by a model that just makes us pay with blood while this, while all of the wealth goes to the United States. It's necessary for each country to look over its own interest. As far as the Colombian elite are concerned, they are fine with having a legal drug market. They have already been a part of it, and those that are involved in the business sector, and they're not interested to normalize or regulate this market formally. They're not interested in that. And so that's one of the challenges that we have before us. So we're almost 10 minutes after the hour. I want to thank our panelists for sharing their time with us today to help us understand what's happening. It's also important to remember that this discussion is showing us that although the wars are declared against drugs, they're ultimately wars that operate against the most poor and vulnerable in the society. And so that invites us as civil society to continue pressure our governments to respond effectively, um, and stand out, speak up against these unnecessary aggressions. Finally, I want to end with this one question for our panelists. We're always focusing on the Caribbean. There's an important question from the chat. What do you think that the countries and civil society outside of the Americas should be doing to halt these attacks in the Caribbean and in the Pacific coast? I would love to for things to happen to detain and halt these attacks. I think organization and coordination, uh, formal declarations, and for being part of organizations and social movements, writing, doing everything that is in our power, and just being active and responding to this. Because the only way to sort all of this out and to understand what is really going on behind the so-called war against drugs is by talking about it and continuing to delve into it. I think even for a 5-year-old child, it's obvious that you can't bomb a boat in the Pacific or in the Caribbean or anywhere. It's important to go beyond that and talk about how this is connected to interests to for regime change and to bring war to our region. So we have to move the conversation towards that. Ali, did you want to respond? Yeah, I think part of what's happened in Palestine and a lot of the mobilization in a lot of countries, for instance, like in Colombia, it's engendered a level of diplomacy or policy that tries to end the genocide, to create a lobby up and bring countries together to bring pressure to end the war in Palestine. And so I think there's a lesson there about what we can do, how to engage with our governments in order to then transmit that message to Donald Trump, making it clear that a war in Latin America or in this region is it's not allowed and that it will not be supported. I'm also a person that likes to think of himself as having his feet on the ground, and I understand that never before have in human history have we had so much accumulation of wealth, such a high level of accumulation of power. It's such a high level that it it eclipses rights and the law, and rights and law becomes just one more instrument in many. It doesn't have the same weight that it did before, and it's just part of an arsenal for the powerful and wealthy, for those that one day decide that if they want to push this button for war, then they'll have their war in the Caribbean, and that'll be that. And we're at their mercy. And so I think humanity has this challenge right now to think about not just how to prevent what's happening right now, and this goes for over 50 to 60 open armed conflicts in the world right now, but to also think about that in relation to the other wars that are being built up for the future in our planet. Well, thank you very much to our panelists for sharing their perspective and for everyone that joined us today. I want to remind you that at Global Exchange, we're committed to promote transnational solidarity and reduce war. Thank you for being with us. We'll see you next time.